Good morning. We'll have now the last session of this conference. And for a conference in central bank, monetary policy as the last session seems very appropriate. We'll have three guys that are pretty involved with the central banks. They work in central bank, worked in central bank, or their work is related to central bank and monetary policy. We have Fabio Canova. Initially, everybody knows him. I hope that some of you have brought his book and get some signature from him. After that, we'll have Marco Rojas from Banco Central de Chile, and then Carlos Carvalho. So, Fabio, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Well, thanks for inviting me for this, present in this conference. I haven't been to Brasilia for a long time. Last time, Andre invited me here to teach a course at the bank, so it's a pleasure to be here. So this work is joint with Fernando Perez Forero, which is at the Bank of Peru, so the disclaimer is for him, not for me. So let me give you very briefly, since I don't have a huge amount of time, some motivations for what is this work about. So I don't think I have to spend much time telling you that the inflation burst of the last 21-23 period was unprecedented for the last 40 years, at least in developed countries, and that created a lot of headaches. There's been quite a lot of work trying to understand what was the source of this. We have seen the paper by Frank before. It says, you know, the debate is basically, is that fiscal policy, is this supply chain disruption, whatever it is. So I'm not going to look at that. Instead, I'm going to ask a question which is, I think very policy relevant, which is basically, is the transmission of monetary policy shock different when inflation is high? And clearly, that's an important question for a policy institution, primarily because you want to know if there is any need to design different policy. We know, for example, when you hit the zero lower bound, and we move to different kind of policy. So we would like to know if there is a high inflation also, do we need to move to different kind of policies? From the point of view of academics, which is where I come from, theory tells you that there should be some difference. So if you take, for example, the standard menu cost type of models, they will tell you that if there is a high inflation, then agent will change the price much more often. Therefore, any price stickiness will be smaller, and hence monetary policy will have much more larger effect on inflation than on real activity. So there should be kind of a trade-off between inflation effect and output effect in a high inflation regime. There are two other theories which basically tell you exactly the same conclusion, even though the mechanism are different. So there is the rational inattention story, which basically tells you that if inflation is high, agents pay much more attention to inflation development. Therefore, there's going to be less effect of monetary policy on real activity. And the recent slanted L type of Phillips curve, which basically says that if you have high inflation, there's going to be a higher production cost. There's going to be a higher vacancy to unemployment ratio, and therefore monetary policy will have a larger effect on inflation than on output. So what do we do here is basically an empirical paper. We're going to look at whether the transmission of monetary policy shocks, two types of monetary policy shock, differ when inflation is high, and we're going to do it with, unfortunately, slightly complicated nonlinear vector autoregressive model, which is called threshold Bayesian VAR model. There's going to be a lot of bells and whistles. I'll try to explain you what it is exactly. We need a model which can capture regimes, so we need a nonlinear model. We need to take care of a lot of things, so this model is slightly complicated. So we're going to try to compare the transmission of monetary policy shock, and we identify two monetary policy shock, what we call a standard or conventional shock, which is what you think about typically, so an unexpected increase in short-term interest rates. And then what we call liquidity shocks. Sometimes these are called forward guidance shocks. Sometimes they are called open market operation shocks, or whatever you want to call them. But basically, these are shocks which basically twist the term structure of interest rates. And then at the end, if I have some time, I'm going to talk about the implication of these results for the three theories that I've mentioned before regarding the trade-off between output and inflation. So let me give you the results so you can sleep or leave and go to the next session. Basically, we do find some difference. They are not huge difference across regimes. So regarding conventional shocks, there is typically a weaker peak effect, but more persistent dynamic in response to conventional monetary shock. And the reason why these things happen, we find it as in a type of informational setup. So conventional policy shock provide information about the state of the economy to the agent, but only in a particular regime, not in both regimes. Same thing for liquidity shock. We find some differences. In this case, there are larger differences across regimes. And again, we do find some evidence which support the idea that there is some kind of information content in these shocks, which agent take is important. Now, if you put these two together, this informational effect, which occurs in particular regime, is inconsistent with any of the three theories that I've talked about before, and therefore I'll try to motivate the conclusion here. I don't have time. There's a lot of literature regarding transmission of monetary policy shock. Let me tell you that there is quite a lot of literature. Look at the first bullet point, which just came out last year, talking about essentially nonlinear effect of monetary policy. The closest paper is the one that is in bold by Gargiulo and others from the New York Fed, which use something very similar to what we use, and I'll try to point out where we differ and in what sense the results are different. The rest is basically standard literature, and let me point out finally the literature on signaling effect of monetary policy, which was started by Leonardo Melosi in this paper in 2017, which has now plenty of evidence in published and unpublished paper. So in case you forgot about this, this is the inflation in the US. There are three series here, just to make sure that you're convinced that it's not going to matter for what I'm going to talk about, which series you use. This is the personal consumption expenditure series. This is the personal consumption expenditure minus food and energy, and the GDP deflator. So as you can see, there are the peak in 2021-23 is unprecedented over the last 40 years. It is comparable only to the peaks in the 70s. And it doesn't really matter which series we're going to use. The message is basically the same. So I'm going to use the personal consumption expenditure series here. This is the histogram of the inflation rates. In red, you see a normal distribution. And so it's obvious that this is not really, the inflation rate doesn't seem to come from a normal distribution. It's skewed. There's a long tail here. So the task is basically, the idea is to try to fit two regimes inside this inflation type of histogram and try to see if there is implication for the upper part versus the lower part of this distribution. So the empirical model, as I said, is slightly complicated, so I'll spend a couple of minutes on it. So as you can see, the model is basically equation 1. If you exclude the lambda, which I'll explain in a second what it is basically a vector autoregression, which depends on each regime. So the constant, the intercept, and the variance-covariance matrix depends on the regime. The regime is dictated by this indicator S. And in equation 2, you see that S is going to be equal to 1 if the inflation rate is less than some threshold pi star. Okay? So the idea is that there's going to be one regime, there's going to be a vector autoregression in one regime, there's going to be another vector autoregression in the other regime. Potentially they are completely different. And the regime is going to be determined by this S indicator. I'm going to estimate both P star together with the parameters and the delay D that you see in equation 2. Basically, I want to know how many months of inflation do I have to see before I switch between regimes. So how fast do I learn, basically? So the main difference with the standard vector autoregression, and that's also the main difference with the paper of Gargiulo that I was mentioning before, is this lambda in the direct equation there. So lambda is a measure of volatility, is going to be the common volatility driving all the variances of this system. The lambda is you can interpret as uncertainty, volatility, but what it does there is going to try to kind of absorb things which are outside of the regime kind of standard dynamics. So as you will, I don't have time to go, but basically what this lambda does absorbs the COVID period. That's what it does. Okay, so it kind of sucks up the inflation dynamics which are due to the COVID period. As I said, the lambda is a scalar, is defined in equation 6. It basically says that it's a simple autoregressive process. Potentially, it could be a unit-root process if f is equal to 1. And all the variance-covariance the elements of the variance-covariance matrix are going to be driven by these time-varying, unique time-varying volatility. We took it from Carriero and company simply because we don't want to have we have already a complicated model. If we have one lambda per equation, it's going to be complicated. So in what is in Z, you see it in there. There's going to be the standard macro variables. So it's going to be output, unemployment, or industrial production and unemployment. There's going to be inflation. And then there's going to be financial variables. There's going to be the nominal interest rate, sorry. There's going to be the yield slope, 10 years minus 3 months. There's going to be commodity prices, there's going to be a stock market indicator, and there's going to be a measure of money, which is not typically what people use, but I'm going to put it in. And I'll explain you in a second why. So how do we identify shocks? We do pretty conventional identification via sign restrictions and zero restrictions. If you don't see anything in a column, it means these are unrestricted, but basically conventional shocks are shocks which increase interest rate and decrease money growth. And potentially they can decrease inflation within a month, but they don't have to. And basically they have no effect on economic activity and unemployment in a month. Liquidity shock, instead, are shocks which move the slope of the term structure, and they are implemented through basically money creations. So money growth will go up. We impose a restriction there on the short-term interest rate to make sure that monetary policy is consistent across maturity. If I have time, I'll go back to that. That thing doesn't change too much the dynamics of what I'm going to present. So let me show you some of the results. So top figure is again the inflation as measured by PCE, inflation. And downstairs you see the regime indicator. So the algorithm picks the two peaks in the 70s and the last peak post-COVID as being the high inflation regimes. Okay? So consistent with eyeballing the series, we find this. The important thing is that neither the 90s nor the 60s turns out to be considered here high inflation regimes. If you want to know what is the threshold, this is the histogram of the threshold, estimated posterior histogram of the threshold. It's basically centered at 5.3%. So when inflation reaches 5.3%, you switch. Funny enough, this is exactly the number that Fauci found using survey data in the US. So he has survey data on inflation expectation, and he found exactly this number. The important thing I want to show you here is that this number is very precisely estimated. If you look at the range here of values of this histogram is very, very tiny. Same thing happened for these delay D parameters. This is even more extreme. So D is basically 2. You need 2 months of high inflation to switch between low to high inflation and vice versa. Okay? So the posterior distribution here are extremely tightly estimated. And I want to specify, to clear up, there is no hidden things here. So priors are very large. They allow for anything to happen. This is simply the information which is in the data. So let me show you the transmission. And let me start with the conventional shocks. So the conventional shock, as I said, is normalized by the increase in interest rate, which is the first box in the second row. So we make sure that the interest rate shock is exactly the same magnitude, has exactly the same persistence to be comparable. Otherwise, we are comparing apples and pears. So as you see, the first row up there, in the low inflation regime, there seems to be a lower or a stronger peak in output and unemployment than in the high inflation regimes. And there seems to be some effect on inflation, but it's not that large difference. If you look at the other pictures of the box here, they look pretty much the same, except for one, which is the slope responses. And in particular, in the low inflation regime, it looked like the 10-year rate reacts much more than a 3-month rate to this monetary policy shocks. Okay, so intuitively, it looks like people expect something happening after this monetary policy shock. So that's the type of things that I call an information effect. And this information effect seems to occur only in the low inflation regime. Okay, so question is, does it make sense, the interpretation I give? Is that really true? And that everything is driven here, the difference that I see across regime is driven by this yield slope? So I do 2 things. The first thing is to run a counterfactual, which is basically I force the slope of the term structure to be the same across regime. What's going to be the implication? And the second thing I'm going to look at 10 years inflation expectation, and I want to see, do they react more in the low inflation regime than in the high inflation regime? So here is the exercise, the counterfactual exercise. Notice the second box in the second row. We force the slope of the yield curve to be exactly the same. In the 2 regime, look at the first row, the response of output and unemployment basically are the same. So it looks like the small difference that we noticed in these 2 variables seems to be due by the slope of the term structure. So by the different responses of the term structure. And in terms of inflation expectation, we do find that in the low inflation regime, which is the blue line, the responses are instantaneously much larger and significant than in the high inflation regime. So the idea is that when inflation is low and monetary policy does something, it means they are kind of surprising the market, or it's giving you information about the market. And the market reacts by adjusting basically inflation, long-term inflation expectations. How about liquidity shock, or these forward guidance shock, whatever you want to call it? So here they are normalized on money growth. We can't really make the 2 regimes exactly the same in terms of persistence. That's the best we can do. And as you can see in the top row, you see that in the high inflation regime, the response of output and unemployment seems to be larger than in the low inflation regime. There is some difference again in the inflation response, but it's not really significant. So how do we explain this difference in real variable? This time, rather than the slope of the term structure, is the stock market, which seems to be reacting differently. As you can see, in the low inflation regime, stock market seems to be reacting negatively, and in the high inflation regime, the stock market seems to be react positively. So again, there seems to be some kind of information which financial market process in different way in the 2 regimes. Again, we'll do the same exercise I've done before. I'm going to do a counterfactual in which I force stock market reaction to be the same. Do I see the same reaction also on the first row? And the second thing, if really stock market is reacting positively to monetary policy, this kind of monetary policy shock, then they should expect something happen in the future. So let's try to see if there is some kind of future development which justify this interpretation. So here is the picture of the counterfactual. Again, last box, we forced the response of the two variables of the stock market in the two regimes to be the same. Look at the top row, there's no difference. So intuitively, it seems like the interpretation we gave, stock market differences, is the reason for why we see difference in output and unemployment across regimes. The question is, what is it why is the stock market reacting? Maybe there is a future profitability, maybe there is some kind of things that is going to happen in the future. It's very difficult to have measures of future profitability of firms, but you can try with a series of new entry, which is what we did. This is a quarterly series, unfortunately, while the analysis we have done is monthly, so we have to reaggregate things. But as you can see here, the response of, in the low inflation regime of net entry seems to be zero throughout the horizon. We consider the one of the high inflation regime is positive 1 year ahead. It's not very strong, it's not very significant, but there is some indication that the stock market is telling you something about future entry of firms or future profitability. Now, what do these results imply for theories? As I told you, menu cost and slanted L theory have strong implication about the slope of the Phillips curve. And in particular, they tell you that the slope of the Phillips curve should be larger in the high inflation regime than in a low inflation regime. Do we see that? So this is the dynamics of the slope of the Phillips curve in the high and low inflation regime. And if anything, it looks like the response is going to be larger in the low inflation regime than in the high inflation regime. This is when we use labor share as a measure of real activity in the Phillips curve. And if you use the vacancy to unemployment ratio, you get basically the same result. That in the low inflation regime, the response of the slope of the Phillips curve seems to be larger throughout the horizon. I have more picture. I don't have time to show them to you, but let me just tell you that we have done zillions, and literally zillions of robustness check to make sure that these results are not specific to what we have done. Let me just mention one, which I think is important, which is the second one. So some people said, well, maybe what you're picking up is just COVID stuff, and we don't know really what COVID is about. So let's do the estimation up to 219. If you do the estimation to 219, the threshold drops. There are many more episodes of what is called the high inflation regime, but the impulse responses basically don't change very much with respect to what I've shown you. So since I've not much time, let me just conclude. So this is a first attempt to try to estimate the potential regime-dependent effect of monetary policy shock. We look at two different types of shocks. It looks like there is some difference. They're not huge. We were expecting much larger effect. The effect seems to be driven by the reaction of financial markets, in particular the slope of the yield curve in the case of conventional shock and the stock market in the case of liquidity shocks. And these effects are pretty much in line to what the paper by Melosi I mentioned at the beginning, which has a model there, kind of explain. I think the important thing here is that these are only regime dependent, which means that these effects occur only in certain period of time. And altogether, this evidence is very much inconsistent with both menu cost and slanted L theory. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabio. Now we'll have Marco's comments, please.
Hi. While I was reading the paper, it's a very complete paper that it has everything that while I was reading it, I thought I should comment. And while I was reading it, I discovered that that was already included later in the paper. So it's hard to have good points to comment about the paper, but I still found something that I think could be beneficial for the paper as a whole. So a little summary of what Fabio just presented. The main question is, does the propagation of monetary policy shocks change in periods of low and high inflation? We know that this is really, really important. We didn't have periods of high inflation up until recently, and maybe some people think that once we go back to normal now, this will not happen again for a long time, but I think this is a good point. It's a good period of time to try to understand what would happen again if we again encounter periods of high inflation. How do the authors try to come up with an answer to this question? Well, they use a threshold VAR model with stochastic volatility that also allows for the endogenous selection of different regimes, low and high inflation regime. The answer to the question is that yes, that high inflation periods do have a different transmission of monetary policy shocks compared to periods of low inflation, and in particular, that the main result that they find is that the peak effect on output is lower in periods of high inflation. However, these last longer. And the channels that they find, that they point out to explain this, come from the dynamics of the slope curve, which in turn are linked to what's going on in inflation expectations. And when they look at the other monetary policy shocks, the ones that affect liquidity, this is related to the net entry of firms. So this is the main figure for the result of the paper, in my opinion. So basically here on the blue line, as Fabio just explained, is the output response of a 1 standard deviation surprise increase in the short-term rate. And you can see that the effect is considerably larger in this blue line compared to the red line, which is in the high inflation periods. Something similar, but to a smaller extent happens for inflation and also for employment. This also holds for commodity prices, S&P 500, and money. And as I mentioned earlier, the main channel for these differences is through the long-term interest rate. So I have basically two bigger comments and then two small comments. The first one is that one could think of an alternative or complementary channel by which this happens, and basically is that the monetary non-neutrality is going to change in periods of high inflation, and that's going to be related to the frequency of price changes, right? So there is already some evidence that we actually have in the paper that I'm going to present later. It's in the paper, not in the presentation, that basically the frequency of price changes rises in periods of high inflation. We showed that for Chile, but also there's evidence that that happens in the US. And that's gonna, if we have less rigid prices, well, then we know that the product response is gonna be dampened. And that's also gonna have implications for how monetary policy should react. And in particular, there's this paper by Karate and co-authors that says that basically in order to engineer certain response on GDP in periods of high inflation, you basically need to act in a stronger, with a stronger rise in interest rate, which goes in line with what the paper by the Fabio presented just showed. So that would be the first comment. The second comment has to do with the fact that the channel by which the excuse me, the channel by which the yield curve is inverted has to do with inflation expectations. And what the authors do in order to corroborate that that's the channel, they run local projections for periods of low and high inflation, and they show that that the reaction happens mostly in periods of low inflation. I think it would be interesting to have maybe a more parsimonious model, because the data for the survey of professional forecasters at a quarterly frequency starts later than the baseline period of the paper. But then, if that were to be included, could be tested directly within the model, right? For instance, the paper already tells us what are the periods of low and high inflation, and therefore there could be like a similar but smaller model that could include inflation expectations, and that therefore could be useful to test this more directly. And finally, I have two smaller comments. So as Fabio showed, they estimate this uncertainty or volatility term lambda that seems to be very highly linked to inflation and not to other variables that we think are connected to volatility and the economy. So this is the series that they have for the recovered lambda. And as you can see, it's pretty flat up until the end of the sample. Now, Fabio commented that the reason why they include this is to kind of absorb the inflation at the end of the period. But I got a slightly confused, and maybe that's my misunderstanding about this being recovered uncertainty, because, for instance, for periods of really high uncertainty, like the great financial crisis in 2008, this is like basically very silent. So I don't know if the terminology is a bit different to what I would have expected, but it still called my attention. And then finally, when the authors show the impulse response function, they mention that they don't restrict the regimes when the shocks happen, right? So when they start at a low period, they could eventually go to the high period or the other way around. And my understanding is that the IRFs that we see is when it's low is always low, and when it's high is always high. But I think the model could be informative of what type of shocks would allow you to transition, for instance, from a high to low inflation regime, and what would be the dynamics in that context. So those are my comments. I think the paper, as I mentioned at the beginning, has a lot of covers a lot of ground, as Fabio was able to show in something like 20 minutes. And so yeah, I'm excited to see where the paper ends up being published. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marco. Fabio, would you like to react to Marco's comments?
Just one reaction. I thank you very much. So, I mean, we are aware about the paper about the changing and the frequency of prices. The only thing it seems like this is inconsistent with the picture I showed you at the end, where the slope of the Phillips curve basically is reversed relative to what the theory says. And the other thing is, I mean, I didn't want to burden you with technical details. This is a very complicated model to estimate. You need a lot of patience. Just one run takes about 3 days on the computer that Fernando has, which is probably top of the line currently. So adding an extra variable like inflation expectation to the model, or we tried, but it just complicates the estimation. So we did this two-step approach in which first we estimated the shocks, and then with the shocks, we do local projection on the variable which are not in the system. But I understand the point. The other complication is that we try to use all the information at monthly data. We have some variable which are at quarterly data of inflation expectation. So we need them to add on top of the complication also mixed frequency estimation which is another layer of complication. So we thought that this was a simpler way of trying to get around, but I understand perfectly the point. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Now we can take some questions from the floor.
Yeah, right.
I just have more like a technical question on how you do the counterfactuals, because I guess that very much depends on which shocks you use to model the alternative path. And do you use the monetary policy shocks or
Yeah, so
the
only-
general set of
only,
shocks?
No, only the monetary policy shock in each of the two experiments. So we are not looking for combination of we are not looking at combination of shocks. Just when we do the counterfactual for the conventional, we use the interest rate shock, and the other way around when we do the liquidity shock.
Because these results could be different, no?
Could change. Yeah, you're
And
perfectly
one could argue that if some of these different reactions come exactly from some other shocks happening, like an output, like expected output shock, then the comparison probably would be.
Yeah, you're perfectly correct. We haven't tried that, so I don't have an answer.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? Okay, so now could move to the next presentation. Marco, please.
All right. Thank you very much to the organizers for choosing our paper. So this is a paper co-authored with Elias and Dagoberto, who are also at the bank, Francesco, who's at the IMF, and Emiliano, who's at the World Bank. As we all work at policy institution, none of what I'm telling you today represents necessarily the views of the central bank, the IMF, or the World Bank. So, as you may know, and this has been discussed already in the conference, price rigidity stands at the forefront of our understanding in macroeconomics, and in particular, the transmission of shocks such as monetary policy shocks or cost push shocks are going to depend a lot on how firms interact, and in particular, how the prices of firms react not only to their cost, but to the cost of the competitors. So there's a vast literature understanding the cost passed through to firms' prices. So for instance, you have the Nakamura and Sessão paper studying the coffee industry, Aaron Schonler studying exchange rate pass-through, Ganapati and Lafrange-Jussier and other co-authors studying energy pass-through. However, there is less evidence on the effect that competitors' prices have on firms' prices themselves. The few exceptions are the Amiti paper and Gagliardone paper, which use Belgian data. And the reason why there's less, one of the reasons why there's less research on the effect of competitor prices has to do with some data limitation. So what we're going to do in these papers, in this paper, is first to show you an improved measure of a strategic complementarity. So for that, we're going to use very granular data that we have access to in the bank. And we're also going to be able to measure marginal cost in a slightly better way. And with this in hand, I'm going to tell you 5 new stylized facts about strategic complementarities. So that's the paper. So what are the 5 facts that I'm going to tell you? The first one is that these strategic complementarities are going to be a lot more important than what the previous literature has documented. And in particular, it's going to be more important than firms' own cost. The second fact is that this is going to vary across sector. However, still going to be still going to be very important for all sectors. The third one is that this strategic pricing is going to be state dependent. So it's going to depend on depending on periods of low and high inflation. The fourth fact is that it's already been reported that firms react differently when their own costs go up or when they come down. And we're going to tell you that there is also a different reaction of firms' prices when their competitors' prices go up and when the competitors' prices come down. And finally, I'm going to show you that firms are going to exhibit a stronger strategic complementarities when they face less competition, which happens when either their market shares are higher, they have many customers, or they have fewer competitors. So I think I have a little time to just tell you a bit what we're doing on top of what the literature has already done. So the first one is that, as I mentioned just now, is that there's very limited evidence on measurement of strategic complementarities, and we're going to improve these by changing the definition of what your competitors or what the market is. So we're going to move from just using the sector to use the sector, the regions where firms operate, and the products that firms sell. The second contribution that the paper is doing is that we're going to be measuring cost pass-through, but instead of focusing on particular inputs such as energy, oil, or the exchange rate, we're going to be use all the intermediate inputs that firms use for their production. We're going to talk about state dependency in price setting with relationship to firms' competitors' prices. And finally, we're going to talk to the literature combining market structure and market concentration to firms' pricing behavior. So let me tell you a little about the data that we use here. So we're going to use the universe of firm-to-firm electronic invoices in Chile. So these are documented that firms have to produce every time they sell to another firm, especially if they're domestic firms. So these are mandatory in Chile starting in 2014. And this is the data from the IRS that is available to us at the Central Bank of Chile. So for each of these invoices, we're going to have a header section that tells us which are the firms selling and buying. Well, we're going to have a date. We're going to have the location where they are buying and selling, and the sector of these firms. And then for each document, we're going to have different entries that are going to tell us about the price, the quantities, a description that we're going to call variety, and we're also going to have, through something that's done at the bank, we're going to have a product category of that particular line in the document. So we're going to focus on the manufacturing and retail and wholesale sectors. We're going to use firms that have at least 5 full-time employees in a year, and we're going to use also firms that belong to this national account registry. Basically, these are large data sets that have a lot of firms or tax ID, so we want to make sure that we're actually working with firms and not with sometimes people that still can be in this data. So our sample is going to have around 6,000 manufacturing firms, 13,000 retail and wholesale firms, and we're going to be focusing in the period between 2014 to 2023. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the empirical approach that we have in the paper. So following the paper by Amidi, Skokie, and Koenings, we can write a firm's price. Here, firms is going to be the firm I, between its marginal cost, MC. I'm here putting a tilde because then I'm going to have another measure that's not going to have a tilde, so that's easy. And its markup, which is going to depend on its own price, the price of its competitors, and any other demand shocks that may affect their prices. We can manipulate this expression to arrive to the following distributed lag expression that you see here, where the variation of a firm's price is going to depend on a firm's fixed effect, a time fixed effect, the cumulated changes in its marginal cost, and the cumulated changes on the price changes of its competitors. So what I'm going to tell you now is how we measure the 3 main elements here: firm's prices, firm's marginal cost, and firm's the variation of the firm's competitors' prices. So these are all multi-product firms. So for us to get to the variation of firms' prices, basically is the expression that we have here, where basically for each of those varieties that the firms sell, we're going to obtain its weighted average, and we're going to use that as this firm's price change for these regressions. So for marginal cost, in order to measure marginal cost, we need to put some structure. So we're going to have a very basic structure where we're going to have a cost and returns to scale production function with labors and materials. We can log linearize and take differences of that production function and arrive to the following expression for the variation of marginal cost. We're going to have productivity, variation on wages, and variation on the unit cost of intermediate inputs. And here you can see that the share of intermediate inputs is going to be firm specific, given by this raw I. We're going to do further assumptions, which are the fact that wages are going to be predetermined for the frequency that we're working with, which is a monthly frequency, and that the productivity of the firm is going to be firm specific, and it's going to have a trend and an error term, and therefore, when we want to measure marginal cost, we can only focus on the unit cost of intermediate inputs. So now we're going to have this redefined expression for marginal cost, which is going to be the share of intermediate inputs times the variation in the unit of cost of intermediate inputs. So here, in this expression, basically we're going to observe for all the firms what are the products that they buy and how important those products are for their total intermediate inputs that they buy. So here in particular, we can observe this CUP product category, and we can obtain basically by how much those prices are changing for that particular firm, sum them across all of those products, and obtain a measure of marginal cost. If I had more time, I could show you some details about marginal cost, but in the benefit of time, I'm going to go to the next part. This is the bigger innovation that we're doing here, which is the measure of competitors' prices. So as I mentioned earlier, when the literature has measured the competitors' prices, they use firms in the same sector. So the best papers, to my knowledge, use 3-digit code sectors, which is still very broad sectors that make each firm to be still very small within that sector. And we're going to use the granularity of our data to measure competitors' prices considering their product and their location. So for each firm, we are going to compute the sales weighted average of the price changes of the locations are where they operate. Then for each of those regions, we're going to look at what are the products that they sell. So for that, again, we're going to use that product category that I showed you earlier, CUP. And for that region, for those products, we're going to look at all the firms that operate there. And for that, we're going to basically sum across those prices from the bottom up until all the competitors of that said firm in the products and regions where they operate. So let me tell you what are the implications of this. So as I show you, I'm going to show you these 5 stylized facts on strategic complementarities. And the first one is that these are going to be overwhelmingly important, and actually are going to be more important than marginal cost. So we're going to run basically the same regression that I showed you earlier, this distributed lag regression. And here on panel A to your left, I have the cumulative sum of this beta R, and you can see that the pass-through of marginal cost to firms' prices is around 18% after a year. Now I'm going to show you the cumulative sum of this gamma R. And what you can see that this is around 0.65, which means that it's around 3.6 times that of marginal cost. Compared to the literature, this is going to be very high, but I'm going to show you exactly the reason why it's higher. So what are we going to do is that we are going to go and use exactly the same measure that other papers have used when measuring competitors' prices. And when we do that, you can see here that the relevance, so the blue line here, is exactly the same one that before. And when I use competitors in a regression, the same regression, but when competitors' prices are measured using just the sector, you can see that the relevance of marginal cost is a lot higher. And then on the flip side, the relevance of competitors' prices is also a lot less. So basically, when competitors are measured using only the sector, we're going to be underestimated the effect that strategic complementarities have on firm prices. One way to look at how this works is to look at the average market share of firms when we use our baseline measure and when we use just the sector. So here in the blue, in the blue box, for both manufacturing and retail sector, you can see that the average market share in our baseline measure is something around like 1% for the manufacturing sector and below 0.5% for the retail sector. And there's considerable variation. However, if you use just the sector, you can see that basically the variation of the market share and therefore what's going to be happening to your competitors' prices is no variation. So basically, in a regression where mechanically, in a regression where your competitors' prices is only defined by your sector, that variable is pretty much the same for all firms, right? Because if you take out one firm to measure the price of your competitors, it's very similar to when one firm is taken out and when the next firm is taken out. And therefore, just mechanically from like basic econometrics, there's not a ton of variation on that variable to identify the parameters. So this is the first fact. Strategic complementarities are a lot more important than what the previous literature has measured and documented. There are, of course, threats to our identification that I'll try to go by quickly. I'm going to be focusing mostly on what's happening on both variables, which is marginal cost and the prices of my competitors. So you could imagine that marginal cost that we're measuring in a no-less regression could have could be very endogenous because basically firms could have buying power over the suppliers, and therefore our measure of marginal cost is not exogenous to firms, let's say, demand. So how do we get around that? Basically, we propose an instrument that is also going to be the marginal cost of those firms, but we're going to exclude all the suppliers that have very few buyers, and therefore the firm itself could have some sort of buying power, monopolistic power on those firms. So by just using large firms with a lot of buyers, those marginal costs are allegedly more exogenous to the firm. And this is the measure that I have here, MC star. The second concern is that there is simultaneity between firms' prices and the prices of their competitors. How do we get around that? Well, we're going to have an instrument that's going to be the marginal cost of all my competitors in those regions and for those products, their marginal cost, but we're going to exclude of those marginal costs of my competitors when we have the same supplier. And therefore, the reason why they're changing their prices is not because we have the same supplier that is raising its prices. When we do this, we obtain a similar result to what I just showed you. We're still working on that because basically now we're having the issue that strategic complementarities are way too important in the IV results. So there's the reason why we're still a work in progress, because even though these instruments, I think, go in the right direction, it's exaggerating a little bit about the results. The second is that this is going to vary a little bit across sectors. So we're now going to run the same regression, but we're going to have a dummy for whether the firm is in the manufacturing sector. And so when we do that, you can see that here, the pass-through for marginal costs in the manufacturing sector here in blue is considerably higher than in the retail sector. And on the flip side, that makes that the strategic complementarities for the retail sector is considerably a lot more important than it is for the manufacturing sector. So for manufacturing firms, retail firms are considerably more attentive to what's going on to their competitors' prices. The third fact is about strategic pricing. This is going to be state dependent. So again, we're going to run the same regression, and now we're going to interact each variable by whether the period is a period of high and low inflation. So there's already evidence of how what happens to the pass-through of marginal cost to prices, and we find something similar to what the literature has found, which is that the pass-through is higher in periods of high inflation compared to periods of low inflation. We add to this literature by also documenting that the pass-through of the change of competitors' prices also goes in the same direction. It's higher in periods of high inflation. The fourth stylized fact is that firms are gonna potentially react differently when not only when costs go up compared to when they come down, but also whether the firms react differently when their competitors' prices go up compared to when their competitors' prices come down. So for that, we're again going to run the same regression, interacting with these two damping variables that take the value of 1 if either marginal costs are positive and if competitor prices changes are positive. When we do that, here in the panel A, we find something similar to what, again, the literature has documented, which is that firms react more strongly when their costs go up compared to when their costs come down. In the same vein, we are documented also that not only happens for costs, but also happens for their competitors' prices. And finally, we are going to try to understand whether this pricing behavior has anything to do with the market where firms operate. So for that, we are again going to run the same regression. We're going to use these dummies for 3 measures of how the market is. The first one is the number of their competitors, the market share of the firms, and the number of buyers. And here we're going to separate for whether the firms are above or below each of these measures in their sector. So whether they have many competitors compared to the rest of its sector, market share, and the number of buyers. What we find here on panel A, this is not exactly in line with what the literature has documented, is that there are no differences on the pass-through of marginal cost with the structure of the market. So sorry. Here, I'm plotting just the cumulative sum of 1 year pass-through. And you can see that when firms have very few competitors, or when they have many competitors, their pass-through of marginal costs is not statistically significant. It's not statistically different to when it's high. The same happens for market share, and the same happens for the number of buyers. However, when we look at the pass-through in the change of competitors' prices, we can see that firms that face lower competition actually react more strongly to the competitors' prices. So here you can see that when you have less competitors, which is a measure of facing less competition, you react more strongly. When you have a high market share, which is going to be also a measure of facing less competition, you react more strongly. And similar for the number of buyers. So, to conclude, I've just shown you the relevance of probability measuring strategic complementarities. When we go back to how the literature has usually measured this, we obtain something similar to what those papers do, and we show that it's different when we measure it in the way that we're proposing it here. So, I'm not going to go back to repeat those facts, but I'm going to tell you that we're still trying to understand what are the implications of this for monetary policy, and also trying to understand whether these IV regressions can be improved, so the paper can be improved as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco. Now we'll have Carlos' comments. Please, the floor is yours.
thanks to the organizers for inviting me to, participate in the conference, present and discuss this very interesting paper. I discussed one of Elias, and I don't remember I think Marco was not in that first paper, like 2 years ago, with this amazing Chilean data set. Or I think Marco was one of the co-authors. You correct me if I... Like 2023, okay. So, but it was like Elias and a large group of co-authors with this very interesting Chilean data. So it's very nice to see the kind of fantastic questions they can address with this type of data. Even though it's a work in progress, like Marco just pointed out, and I got like a draft that was still a couple of stages behind what he presented today. But I think there's a lot of potential to the paper. You can see, the question is important, the data are better. So, and on top of that, it's a 5 facts paper in the title, so the chance of a top 5 publication goes up immediately. So I'm gonna kind of play the role of a referee to some extent. I'm gonna try to raise the bar, and I think there's one place where it's going to be difficult for you to try to address the issue, but I think it would be important to do. Okay, so quick summary, Marco presented very well. So it's on how firms' prices react to shocks and competitors' prices, with an emphasis on the latter. They use this amazing data set on Chilean firms, where they have a lot of information on the firms, suppliers, customer firms, and other, like the workforce of the firm, and production, sales, a lot of stuff. And they established these 5 facts about strategic complementarities. I use quotes here because my comments are going to start quibbling a little bit about the use of that term. So strategic complementarities are more important than costs, quote unquote. Heterogeneity in strategic complementarities across sectors. It's state dependent. They emphasize inflation as kind of an important variable to understand variation in the strength of these complementarities. There are asymmetries, like the asymmetries we had seen for a reaction of prices to costs. There are asymmetries in the reaction of prices to competitor prices, where they go up or down. And complementarities vary with market structure. So I think it's a great paper, a lot of potential, and the data set is amazing. I'm going to focus on 3 issues. One is more like a quibble, really, about how the word strategic complementarity is being used, and kind of the reference to the earlier literature is written. Then I'm going to move to an apparent quibble, which might seem like it's the same point, but that apparent quibble then is going to take me to the more substantial comments I'm going to make, which I think are kind of a challenge I would propose for the authors to try to address somehow. Okay. So one is a bit how earlier papers are cited, and the concepts, right? So in the end, a lot of the mechanism and the phenomena that the authors are after, they're trying to interest, is about mechanisms that make prices react sluggishly or faster. Understand price setting. And a lot of this goes back to Ball and Romer, really, in 1990, okay? But I see that the authors, Ball and Romer is cited, but a lot of the references it seems like this literature started very recently with Amit et al., Gopinath work. Also, like on the reference for how complementarities may affect monetary non-neutrality. Again, the authors refer to Clenau and Willis 2016. There's kind of almost 20 years earlier literature where all these facts had been sort of first established, and kind of the seminal papers, Kimball 95. So one is just like, I think it's nice to be more precise here and go back and reference the guys who really started this. Related, but moving into my more substantial question. The table's a bit small here. I resorted to ChatGPT. It has to do with the origins of this word strategic complementarities, okay? In macro, it really started with Cooper and Jones, so it's the second line, and then Ball and Romer with this idea of real rigidities and how it relates to strategic complementarity. Before that, it was used in more sort of game theoretical literature, right? And it's really, as it evolved and became incorporated to macro, so strategic complementarity is really like reflecting something that if one agent takes an action, that increases the incentives for another agent to take an action in the same direction. So complementarity, okay, here, if we're thinking about prices, if some firms raise prices, that increases the incentives or pushes one given firm to also raise prices, okay? The word strategic here is tricky. I think it pushes you to think about what your competitors are doing, some game between the firms, but in fact, that doesn't need to be the case, okay? Complementarities are really just this idea that there are mechanisms that push you to move in the same direction as others. It can be because of strategic considerations and competition in a given market. It could be for other reasons as well, okay? And that's what I'm going to sort of exploit a bit to maybe push the others to try to address this. Okay, so what they do empirically, they start from this idea that, prices are a markup on over marginal cost. Now they're, dealing a bit more with the possibility that this marginal cost is also endogenous with this leave some firms out type instruments, which I think is great. And the focus is a lot on the markup, which is allowed to depend on the firm's own price and the competitors' prices. So this idea that's really about competition in the markets where they are selling and the elasticities and so forth. Okay, and then they have sort of an empirical version of that equation with this distributed lag representation. It's some approximation. There's kind of an empirical. There's some empirical assumptions going into here, but that's all fine. So the first issue I'm going to raise is not like about endogeneity, which is going to be my second point, but it's really just about measurements, right? I mean, marginal costs. I think you can measure one component pretty well, which is the input prices. But one can think that there are many other components to marginal costs, and you guys make some effort to work with wages. But wages may not really represent the marginal cost of the labor input if you have the contract wage and so forth. So I think at least acknowledging that in relative terms, maybe your measure of competitors' prices is more precise than your measure of marginal costs. This would naturally tend to bias the precision, not only the precision, but to tend to bias downward your estimate of the coefficient of marginal cost because of classical measurement error, okay? So relative more than whatever measurement error you have in your competitors' prices. So I think that's kind of one thing that maybe it's hard to do a lot about, but at least talk about this possible driver of, a bit of the difference. Maybe there's a bit of bias there, okay? More importantly, and this goes back to the second comment that I made, which seemed like a quibble. Again, strategic complementarities can arise due to mechanisms whereby the complementarity really flows through the cost rather than competition in the product market. Okay. So rather than having the equation that they assume, which is the first one, where marginal cost and then the markup is really made explicit that it can depend on prices, you can have a situation where marginal costs also depend on the firm's price and other firms' prices, okay? And I think this poses a challenge to identification. You handle some of these cases with this idea that, okay, let's leave out like a common supplier and so forth, but I think there's one type of mechanism which the new Keynesian literature has explored quite a bit, which you guys don't handle, okay? So for examples of mechanisms whereby the complementarity comes through the marginal cost, one is intermediate inputs, right? Work by Susanto Basso way back, then Nakamura Steinson, and all of this literature on intermediate prices. I think you guys handle that well because you have good data, you go and measure this component and so forth. But here's a second case where I think is just an example, but where I think you can run into problem, okay? Let's take the Bible, and by Bible here I mean Mike Woodford's book on interest and prices, 2003. And he worked with this idea of industry-specific labor, which is really mathematically is akin to having like firm-specific factor markets, okay? He emphasizes labor, but you could have firm-specific factor markets. And here what happens is, imagine if your competitors increase their prices, you become relatively cheap. Given your current price, you become relatively cheap relative to your competitors. Demand will shift in the favor of you, the firm who didn't yet react to your competitors increasing their price. If you don't increase your price, your marginal cost tends to go up. Okay, if you have these specificities at the firm level, maybe you have to pay overtime for the labor force that you have. That's the margin that you can adjust in the short run. Maybe you don't increase your labor contractually, but you have some future promise of compensation that, in practice, your effective marginal cost is going up. And then what you do is you tend to increase your price to handle, even if it's a constant markup model, you're going to increase your price in response to an increase of your competitor's price, because in the end, it would drive your marginal cost up big time. In equilibrium, you don't see your marginal cost move up much because you increased your price, so you didn't become as cheap relative to your competitors. Hence, demand does not shift as much in your favor. You don't observe the marginal cost moving as much, but economically, you are reacting to costs. You have by hypothesis, I'm assuming you have constant markup here. So this is kind of an example to say that in the end, if you want to be more general, there's an equation missing here, which is saying that marginal cost can also be endogenous to the firm's relative price, relative to its competitors. It's really the price relative to the competitors. That's what's going to drive demand away or closer to the firm. And trying to handle that, I think, would be important to give more credence to the results, but which I think are great. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Marco, would you like to?
Yeah. Thank you for the thoughtful comments. With respect to the literature, I think so far we focus more on recent literature that is more empirical and applied, and I think that's because we're not, for the moment, making any stance on the model, but point taken that we should probably go back and start mentioning this first paper, but we focus on empirical ones for the most part. The word in strategic complementarity, I think it's also really important. It's something that maybe we should be more specific, because actually also in the paper sometimes we go strategic complementarities, then we go strategic pricing, and I think it maybe cries for a bit more, something more conceptual or definition at the beginning to then start talking about it. And I think we're just very hand-wavy about, well, is the variation of your competitors' prices, we're just going to call it that strategic complementarities or strategic pricing. But yeah, I think we should narrow that more down. And with respect to the last point, that's something that I hadn't thought about it. In a way that's true, especially given that we have the whole network of prices, in reality, maybe some of my suppliers, some of my competitors interact in a way with my suppliers in a way that goes beyond just the fact that one buys from the other, and that can affect my own marginal cost through that channel. I think you could still arrive to an equation like the distributed lag equation that we have, just the underlying elasticities on the coefficients would be different, but then the interpretation is definitely also going to be different. It's something that I hadn't thought. It makes a lot of sense, but I also think it's a lot more challenging in terms of how you interpret this, and also getting around even more the endogeneity that we already are reported and trying to solve. But yeah, thank you for the comments. Yeah.
To emphasize the point. So the point is that I think you're right, you would arrive at exactly the same kind of specification. The thing is that you would misattribute some sensitivity that's really due to marginal cost. It would show up as sensitivity to competitors' prices, right? Yeah. So it's really, econometrically it's just an endogeneity issue, but because the channel is through your price relative to your competitors, it would appear as more sensitivity to the competitors when it's really a channel through your marginal cost.
Yeah.
I think that's the challenge.
Yeah, and just one small point that I wasn't mentioning of what you presented is that we actually do try to improve on our measure of marginal cost. We use these IO tables at the product level that talks to these CUP product categories that we mentioned, and we try to get rid of, so we have like a certain threshold. So according to those IO tables, there are firms in certain sectors that should not be buying any of certain products, and we even if we observe them in the data, we drop them. So unfortunately, sometimes in Chile, like for instance, pickup trucks are a easy way to like buy cars through your company. So for instance, that happens like all sectors buy these pickup trucks, but then you go on the IO table and they're not. That's just a very small example, but that it's kind of how we try to get to a better measure of marginal cost. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now I have some questions from the floor, over there and there.
Hi. Yeah, great paper. Coming back to Carlos' comment, I think you could test this, this mechanism by maybe estimating the response of marginal cost to changes in competitors' prices. And maybe, as Carlos said, maybe you wouldn't observe it as much, but maybe if you could isolate those firms that do not raise their price, that indeed face higher demand, do their marginal cost increase? And this would be a way to kind of indirectly alleviate the concern.
Yeah, it's something we should look at. I hadn't thought, because this is already so interconnected, that I felt that this is adding another layer. It makes a ton of sense, but it's something that we could potentially test if we want to make sure that this is not a relevant channel.
Okay.
Thank you.
So if I can comment very briefly, I think the challenge is measurement, right? Because the whole point is that if you haven't measured that, you cannot just put it to the left-hand side to assess the sensitivity, the importance of the competitor's role. So it's really about measurement of the marginal cost. You have to think of ways to, if there are components of marginal cost that have this channel and you haven't measured those components, so I think.
Okay, oh, please.
Hi, thanks for a very nice presentation. It's a really nice data set you have there. So correct me if I'm wrong, but in the Amiti paper, the coefficients on the marginal cost and on the competitor prices roughly sums to 1.
Yeah.
But if I saw correctly here in your estimates, they're somewhat lower than 1. So I was just thinking whether there could be any other aspects here that can affect the markup in this case. And you know, one thing I thought about that you mentioned was multi-product firms. So I was just thinking if firms could use, you know, a greater product variety to affect their markups and thereby, you know, which in turn then would affect their prices. So maybe that could be something to try to include as well in the regression to control for the number of products that the firms sell. Is that something you have considered or thought about? Thanks.
Yeah, we haven't thought about that. Controlling for multi-product, I guess if they have the same products across time, we're already controlling for that. I think in their paper, they only sum to 1 when it's IV, not when it's OLS. And here I presented the OLS result. When we have IV, it does actually sum to 1, but in that case, the role of strategic complementarities goes up considerably more, so that's kind of like the issue that we're dealing with at the moment. But in that case, it also sums to 1. But I should check whether, because I think theirs still sums to a higher number in the ROLS than it does to us. So that's something that I'm pretty sure that's still the case. It's just, it doesn't sum to 1 to them in their paper, but it's still higher than in our case. But thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? Okay, so then we should move to Carlos' presentation.
Okay, thanks again to the organizers. Now to present my paper with co-authors Andrea Ferreiro, Felipe Mazin, and Fernanda Necchio. Fernanda is at the San Francisco Fed, so we have the disclaimer for her. It's about R-star, if you will, so real rates, and we're focused on low frequency, trying to understand and study a bit more the role of demographics. And here, relative to earlier work where we emphasize, the role of increasing longevity and so forth in kind of a closed economy, looking at sort of mechanisms. Here, we're going to try to raise the bar a little bit for this demographic story by taking into account the fact that, there are capital flows. So one country's determinants of real rates, so in this case, focus on demographics, will affect other countries. Capital mobility is imperfect, so we're going to have like a model, and then when we do empirics, we're going to try to handle imperfect capital mobility. And so if this is an important driver of real rates, we should be able to see across countries and over time this evidence of, or this link between demographics and sort of low frequency developments in real interest rates. I think the motivation is very common to many of these papers on R-star, so real rates have trended down for quite a while. There are papers that look at much longer time spans of even centuries. We're going to be focused on this period since the 80s or 90s. But in addition to trending down since the late 80s, there's been this narrowing of the range of real rates across countries. And in this paper, we're going to try to look at this through the lens of increased financial integration over time in a world, where so this measure of imperfect capital mobility is sort of decreasing, or capital is becoming more mobile over time, and to what extent that helps us understand the path of real rates, and also the sensitivity of real rates to domestic versus global determinants as capital markets become more integrated, okay? So those are the questions. How do demographics affect interest rates in open economies, which is what the world looks like? So the role of domestic versus foreign demographics, but also other determinants other than just demographics, and the interaction of these determinants, demographics more specific, with imperfect capital mobility, which I think is kind of a novel component in the more theoretical, the model part of the paper. Okay, so we develop a multi-country life cycle model with imperfect capital mobility. Demographics vary across countries. And in our calibration, they account for about 1/3 of the decline in real rates that we see between 1990 and 2019, so just pre-pandemic. Financial integration, that's increasing over time. We're going to measure that in the data and then relate it to some object in the model. So that shifts the sensitivity of real interest rates towards global factors and global demographics in particular. And that explains about half of the narrowing of the range of real interest rates that I just showed in the first chart. Okay. In the second part of the paper, we do some empirics. So it's a panel error correction model with real rates and a bunch of real interest rates determinants that the literature has studied. And we try to bring to the empirics some lessons from the structural model, okay? It's by no means a structural estimation of the model. It's very, very far from that. But there are this lesson that financial integration shifts the sensitivity of interest rates to the determinants over time. We try to incorporate that empirically in our panel error correction model, okay? We find that global factors are significant drivers of real rates. We use like a global rate as a summary of all the global determinants of real interest rates. Domestic demographics are significant and enter with the sign that you would expect once we control for fiscal policy. Okay, so here also there's a cautionary note for, part of the literature that looks at bivariate relationships, sometimes at quite long horizons, sometimes at not so long horizons, and say, oh, I cannot find evidence. in our case here, we find it's really important to control for many of the determinants, or in a sense, account for many of the determinants of real rates for you to see, results that make sense. Quantitatively, sometimes they are close to what the models would suggest, but if you do bivariate things, you don't really spot those relationships. And among other drivers of interest rates, pension spending is quite important empirically. The model will also suggest that pension spending is an important variable. Okay, I'm going to talk about that a little bit. There's a large literature on this, quantitative models, empirical analysis, and other determinants of low and declining interest rates. I'm going to skip for the sake of time. If people want to talk about that, I'll be happy to. So the model, I'll give an overview and then try to hopefully cover also a bit of the empirics. So it's an open economy life cycle model. The life cycle dimension is quite stylized. We use the Gertler model. For those of you who don't know, basically think of the Blanchard and Yari, this perpetual youth model whereby people live, work, and with some probability they die, right? The Gertler model adds one stage, which is there is some probability that people will retire, and then after they've retired, there's some probability that they will die, okay? So it's, again, this Poisson constant probability type models, but with this extra stage in life, which is, Minella, the time stopped somehow. So it's a very tractable model, okay, and that will help us in some things. Demographics are going to be time varying, these probabilities of dying, the labor force, growth, and so forth. So demographics are going to be time varying and different across countries, as in work by my co-author, Andrea Ferrero. And then we're going to introduce imperfect capital mobility by assuming there is a friction which is going to take the form of a portfolio holding costs that will hamper perfect financial market integration. Here is kind of a shortcut to be able to have imperfect capital mobility in the model. We don't want to push too far, the story, the market foundation. And we borrowed this from work by Cheng, Liu, and Spiegel, a paper on China. Okay, so there are workers and retirees in each country. The model can have an arbitrary number of countries. In the calibration, we're going to work with 3 countries. There's an idiosyncratic risk of retirement, which is this lottery, this probability that people are working, but they'll retire. And then there's also some probability that they will die once they've retired. People consume one good and save through capital, government bonds, or investing in foreign assets. The supply side of the model is quite standard. There's representative firm, employing capital, labor, and there's some trend growth. And the government spends, pays pensions, and to that end, it taxes the workers and also issues government debt. Okay. So each period there's a new cohort of people that are born as workers. A big chunk of them remain workers. Some fraction of them retire. These omegas and n are depend on each the country. They are country specific, and they're going to potentially vary over time. Okay. For what I'm going to do here, we're going to keep the retirement probability constant, this omega, and we're going to play with the survival probability for retirees, which is the gamma, and the labor force growth, which is n. Okay. From that, you can derive very simply the evolution, the law of motion for the dependency ratio. In this model, there's only a no dependency ratio because people are born workers and then they age. Okay, so it's just the ratio of the number of workers to the number of retirees to the number of workers, and you can work out the dynamics for this. So it's kind of a simple model. Let's go through. Don't focus too much on like the ugly math, but I'll try to tell you the problem of retirees first and then workers, so we solve it backwards, as usual. So retirees, they basically have to decide how much to consume from the assets they have accumulated and the pensions they receive, okay? And then how much they are going to carry into the next period, and they die with some probability gamma. In the budget constraint, where I think it's kind of, you can see the interesting things, on the right-hand side, they accumulated assets. Basically, they deposit these assets into a mutual fund, and then the fund sort of collects the returns and then distributes to the ones that survive. So the guys who die, the proceeds on those assets get redistributed to the retirees that survive. The retirees receive pensions, which is the E variable on the right-hand side, and then they consume and decide on the portfolio. And for the portfolio, they have these frictions, which I mentioned, these portfolio holding costs, which is going to be the source of imperfect capital mobility in the model. Okay, so this lambda MLT is the portfolio holding cost. Okay, there are some objects that are important to solve the model. Okay, yeah, I mentioned all of this, okay? Now, let's move to the worker. So imagine we have solved the retirees problem. We know how the retiree is going to optimally consume and carry on, assets to the future. Now, as a worker, the worker has to again decide how much to consume and how much to save. There's no labor supply choice here in the model. Everybody, there's a worker who works like one unit of labor supply. They receive a wage W. They pay taxes. These taxes are used to fund the government expenditures and the pensions. And again, subject to the portfolio frictions. The difference is that now the worker has to take into account that with some reasonably large probability, the person will remain as a worker next period. And then with some other probability, the person will, with the complementary probability, the person will retire, okay? And then face the problem of a retiree from next period onwards. So that's the problem of the worker. From the first order conditions, from the optimality conditions, you can see where the costs here, from the costs create a wedge between the returns. So this is what prevents full return equalization, and that's kind of the novelty that, we want to have a model where there's room for domestic factors to affect real interest rates, but also global factors, and the sort of the importance of these variables depends on how much capital mobility there is in the model, and this is controlled by these lambda parameters that I mentioned. You can see that this creates a wedge in the sort of return equalization equation that you would get otherwise. The tractability of the framework makes it such that the portfolio choices are all the same, like how much they carry of assets of various countries. So it's it becomes kind of a life cycle that's relatively rich, but very, very simple and tractable, relatively easy to solve. So all these shares are kind of the same for retirees and workers and so forth. So I'm going to skip the details. We can aggregate all the workers and all the retirees and look at the evolution of their marginal propensities to consume. They do not depend on individual characteristics, so it's the same for all workers, and another marginal propensity that's the same for all retirees. It depends on probability of survival, of course, all these objects, but it doesn't have an idiosyncratic dimension, an individual specific dimension. So it's quite easy to aggregate and have the aggregate sort of consumption function for retirees is just this marginal propensity to consume times the value of all assets, and this includes the present discounted value of the pensions. And then for workers is the marginal propensity to consume, which is constant to all workers, times the present value of all assets, which includes the financial assets, present discounted value of human capital, and of discounted benefits as well. The firm side, like I said, is quite standard. There's a representative firm or perfectly competitive firms, if you will, employing labor and capital. There's some trend productivity here. And nothing is special here. In terms of the government budget constraint, so the government taxes, issues bonds, and receives these fees. We assume that these fees are paid out to the country where you invest, right? These portfolio costs, if I want to invest in some other country, we give the fees or the resources that you have to incur to hold the assets of the country, we give them to the government of the other country. So taxes, bonds, and some revenue from these foreign capital, if you will. And that's used to fund expenditures, pay pensions, and repay interest on and the previous debt, okay? We assume these objects are kind of shares of total output, exogenous, and we're gonna, do some comparative statistics, see how they affect equilibrium. There's some balance of payments, identities, and so forth. I'm gonna speed up a little bit so I can show you results and talk about the empirics as well, okay? So we calibrate the model, assuming there are 3 countries, like I said. One is like the world economy, and then we have 2 sort of stylized small economies. One is a relatively young economy, the other is a relatively old, and this is the rest of the world. They're kind of tiny relative to the world. The young economy has a higher growth rate of the labor force and a lower dependency ratio. The old economy has the opposite, lower growth rate of labor force, higher dependency ratio. The world economy is in between. These are moments taken from the cross-sectional distributions of these 19 OECD countries that I showed behind the graph in the first slides. And also we target data on real interest rates in the beginning of our transition, which is 1990, and then also on foreign assets and liabilities from late Milesi Ferretti, and this is what pins down the size of this portfolio friction that prevents full capital mobility, okay? The rest is kind of standard parameter values. These are the exogenous drivers: population growth for the young country, the old country, and the world economy, the evolution of dependency ratios, assets and liabilities. And this is what we get in terms of results. So interest rates trend down. This is transitions driven by demographics and increased financial mobility. So there are 2 things here. There's a narrowing of the range between rates that I talked about. So we're really after these 2 things. One is the trend, the other is kind of to what extent financial integration can explain the narrowing. There's some non-monotonic dynamics here which are kind of interesting. It has to do with what the rate would have been in autarky and dynamics of financial integration. I'm not going to have time to go over, but the model can produce some rich results. It's not going to everything be like monotonic and as one might expect initially. We do some counterfactuals that I'm going to skip because I want to talk a little bit about the empirics. I assume Fabio is going to comment and maybe suggest things for the empirics, so let me try to get to that. There's a bunch of counterfactuals. Let me talk about this table very briefly. Here, we just do some comparative statistics. If I change TFP growth from half to 0.6% and so forth, what would be the effect on the real rate in the beginning of the transition and towards the end of our sort of quote-unquote in-sample period. And here what I want to point out is that, pensions, but also retirement age, they have sort of sizable effects on potentially sizable effects on real rates. And what I find interesting is if you contrast government spending with pensions, in both cases we're doing a comparative statistics of an increase of 1 percentage point of GDP, so from 25 to 26%, and here from 7.5 to 8.5%. So in terms of the impact on the government's budget constraint is kind of the same, right? One you're spending, the other you're just giving out more pensions. The effects on equilibrium real rates are very different, right? And pensions have a much higher effect, and the intuition here is the incentives to save, right? If you just spend more, if it's just G, the effect here is these non-Ricardian effects because it's a life cycle model, so Ricardian equivalence doesn't hold, and that has real effects. But if you spend more because you're giving out more pensions, that changes people's incentives to save because they know they're going to receive more in retirement, so they save less. And these incentives to save less pushes up real interest rates big time. So I think the difference here is kind of informative of the importance of these incentives to save, okay? Very briefly, because I'm running out of time. In the panel, in the empirical part, like I said, we run panel regressions with real rates on the left-hand side. We try to construct ex-ante real rates using like some idea Hamilton suggested in 2016. And a bunch of potential determinants of real rates on the right-hand side, okay? And I think the part I like about the empirical part is the attempt to control or take into account this idea that financial integration matters and that it has varied over time, okay? How we do that, basically, we're gonna run a panel error correction model, so changes in real interest rates across the various countries. They depend on lagged real interest rates, the world, real interest rates, domestic demographics, other domestic determinants, okay? And also the same thing for the rest of the world. And the idea is to have these 1 minus lambda variables. So, sorry, theta. This is omega, right? Capital omega, whatever. Like, as financial integration goes up, we sort of put more weight on global variables. So we kind of interact the global real rate with the financial integration, and we sort of reduce the weight on domestic variables and so forth, right? So it's kind of an attempt to bring to the empirics, put a little bit of structure that's motivated by the model. Is by no means an empirical structure estimation, and so we run these regressions. I'm out of time, so I'm just going to show one result. So here's what we get. The global rate is always significant. Like I said, we use the global rate as kind of a summary of all global determinants in our specification, rather than trying to have global life expectancy, global growth rate of labor force, and so forth. And demographics, once you include fiscal variables, so if you just run, for example, demographic variables, like even life expectancy comes out with the quote-unquote wrong sign given the theory, growth labor force is not significant. Once you control for fiscal variables, and here pension spending is the key, you start getting results that sort of at least make sense given the theories, like higher life expectancy, lower real rates, higher growth rate of labor force increases real rates, higher pension spending increases real rates. We do some back of the envelope calculations, show that these numbers are close to what you see in the data. What the model gives. And one final result very quickly is we show the importance of sort of trying to account for this increased financial integration somehow. We do this by running a regression where we don't account for financial integration, and results get a little bit crazy. Life expectancy still retains a negative sign and significant, but even the global rate, you're regressing real rates on the global rate. You would expect this to really be stable and so forth. Even the global rate sort of loses significant changes sign if you don't account for financial integration. That's kind of our selling point for doing this. Yeah, I'm out of time, so I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Now we'll hear Fabio's comments.
Thanks for asking me to discuss this paper. I'm not probably the best person to discuss this paper, but I'll try to do my best. So let me try to put it in perspective first. So as Carlos said, this is a paper about the real rate, the decline of the real rate. We have heard stories for the last 15, 20 years by Bernanke, the Saving Gluts, Summers, Blanchard, in which demographic factors are going to be important. So I think it's important to have a model here to try to quantify or think about these problems. If you look at empirical literature, the best tools available are Laubach and Williams model, or Lubick and Mattes Kalman filter setups, which basically do not take into account any demographic factors. So I think this is an important contribution, and it's a line of work by the authors. So I think this is important. In terms of what the contribution is, let me just summarize what Carlos said very briefly. So they have two parts. There is a model part and an empirical part. The model part is an extension of previous work by two of the co-authors. And the question is basically very simple. How important are demographics really for this decline of interest rate? And differently from the 2016 paper, you're not going to look just at one country. They're going to look at international dimensions, and in particular how much they can explain of the decline in the spread of these real interest rates. And basically, I think the results are interesting. The presentation is fair. Demographic trends, they account about 1/3 of the decline in the real interest rate. Combined with financial integration, they explain about 1/3 and 1/2. And I think that's an important thing. So financial integration has contributed to make real interest rate decline. And then as he has explained in empirical work, basically he finds that this demographic factor turned out to be important and the global rate turned out to be important. The importance of especially the demographic factor starts becoming clear when you have fiscal variable in there, in particular pension spending and things of that type. So in terms of the model, I don't have much to say, really. I'm a newcomer to this literature, so I read the paper, I read the model. What I'm missing primarily is some kind of intuition of what's going on here. The model is relatively complicated for someone who doesn't know the literature. And I think the reader will benefit if you have some kind of explicit section on intuition, or if you can have a much smaller model in which you kind of highlight the mechanism, pretty much like Frank has done this morning, in which he gave the intuition on a much simpler model than what's going on. So I think that's the main concern I have about the model, that is not transparent exactly what are the mechanisms which drive the real interest rate down. I have two small technical issues. So the solution here is a perfect foresight solution to solve the model. There is no explanation for why they chose this solution rather than simple rational expectation. And the question is, are nonlinearity really important? Do we really want to take into account this transitional path seriously, or can we take a linear approximation? From the picture that he has shown, the real interest rates seem to have some kind of strange dynamics sometimes. So it may be that nonlinearity are important. Maybe it's important to mention that. There is one other thing that wasn't clear to me, is that once you do the simulation, it's not clear exactly how you add back trends in the model. It seems like you're adding some kind of HP filter trend to the simulation, which seems to be inconsistent with what the model has, but I haven't really understood exactly what is there. So probably some clarification there is going to be useful. In terms of the empirics, I'm a little bit concerned about the fact that empirics seems to be kind of orthogonal to what the model is doing in a couple of senses. The first one is, I'm not sure that the vector error correction is or the panel error correction model is the natural counterpart for the exercise you're doing in the theoretical model. And the reason is, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, as I said, the model is solved nonlinearly. We are using here a linear specification. The second thing is that the model has many more variables than simply the real interest rate. So by simply substituting in the variable of the model, we're going to get a specification, implicit specification for the real rate, which is a nonlinear Varma model. So lots of lags, lots of moving average terms. So I'm not really sure that the error correction will approximate that model in an interesting way. There's another issue which I would like to point out. It's not specific to this paper, it's in general specific to this panel exercise, which is there is a lot of detail here about controlling for interaction terms with financial integration, which I think is a great thing to do. But there is one issue, which is dynamic heterogeneity, which is basically not taken into account. So we're pulling together here 19 countries. They are relatively homogeneous, but it would be interesting to know how important is this assumption of dynamic homogeneity. And what I'm talking about, as I say here, has to do with the gamma coefficients of the error correction term. Okay, if this is country-specific, then you can show, or region-specific or group-specific, you can show that the estimates of the other coefficient are all biased. And I have a paper in the Journal of Applied Econometrics from last year where I show this. So I think it's important at least to think about if there are these heterogeneity, if there are groups in these 19 countries, and if not, simply say, no, these are not important. So the question is, how would you link then the model to the data? I think the model has already important implication, and it could stand by itself. You don't need to do any empirical work. But if you really want to do it, then I would be probably interested in knowing what is the effect of a demographic shock. So how do we think about the demographic shock on the transitions of the real interest rate, both across time and across units? And here you need to think about, what kind of tools will kind of drive you to give an answer to the question, in particular, because we are talking about some kind of transitional dynamic. We are not talking about something around the steady state. And it's not really obvious how you do this, but you can think about approximating different steady state with Markov switching or something like this. That probably would be a more appropriate way of testing the theory than the error correction approach. But in general, I think this is a great paper. I think it's important. It gives you very clear answer about the questions that we're giving at the beginning, were posed at the beginning, meaning, how important are demographic factors for the decline in interest rates? And I think I should congratulate the authors for that.
Thank you, Fabio. I think Carlos wants to react to
Oh, great.
comments.
Thanks a lot, Fabio, for the comments. Okay, very, very quick. So on the intuition, I completely agree. Like, even though I argue the model is simple, but it's not simple enough for you to see like the channel there. Our first paper, we try to do a little bit more of that. But the main intuition is basically, I think the main phenomenon we're kind of arguing for is this idea that life expectancy is increasing. Of course, in the model, people understand that, and they plan for retirement properly, and they save more. And so these incentives to save more are the main factor driving down the real interest rates. Okay, so that's kind of the intuition. Actually, is a good point. I rushed through the thing. I didn't state it. And for people not familiar with the literature or these channels, is not clear. So, but I completely agree. It would be nice to have some version where we could show the math, right? Okay, so he's going to be here. Maybe like in a future paper, we have other ideas in this literature, so we might do that. About the solution and the nonlinearity. So we really want to think about these transitions, right? So the idea is that you go to a world with higher, let's say, life expectancy and lower labor force growth due to lower fertility, and you never go back to the thing. So it's going to be important to at least have, move from one steady state to the other. To what extent the dynamics around these two steady states are different or not, it's an interesting question. We haven't exploited that to sort of linearize and look at dynamics around different steady states. On the HP trend, I think, so here is important to explain what we did, okay? So basically, the drivers of the transition in the model are these increases in longevity and this decline in fertility, pretty much, and the increase in degree of financial integration, which the counterpart in the data is these assets and liabilities going up, right? So we want to feed through the model these exogenous paths for the probability of dying, so which maps into the survival, the life expectancy, the labor force growth, and the lambdas, the frictions, which have as counterpart these assets, right? And basically, so we want the model to emulate these trends, which we take as the, so basically the HP trends are the data targets that we want to emulate with the transition in the model, okay? And then perfect foresight versus, so we have the perfect foresight. We also have this other solution, which isn't the same spirit, but it's the extended path approach, whereby agents, they don't really understand the full transition. They get surprised every period, right? So life expectancy goes up, they understand it has gone up, but now they expect it to remain at that level. And then life expectancy goes up again, and they're surprised. So that, you know, the results don't change qualitatively, but we prefer the extended path because the perfect foresight really front loads a lot of the results as people really anticipate they're going to live 10 years more, 20 years from now, and it is more of a stretch in terms of rationality. On the empirics, I'm completely on board, okay. The dynamic heterogeneity stuff is something we certainly have to look at. On the thing of really trying to connect the empirics more with the model, I think it's the right thing to do, is to raise the bar. Say, look, you guys are estimating the model that's only loosely motivated by the theory, and you know, maybe we have to work more on that. We saw this as really a first, and that's why I emphasize that it's by no means an attempt to estimate the structural model. It's really like, there are some lessons here from the model. In the empirics, people do these linear methods. We're going to do the same, but bring in some lessons. So it's kind of a baby step towards, you know, using the theory to do some empirics. But I'm on board with you, and I think there's a lot more to be done here. So thanks a lot, Fabio.
Thank you, Carlos. Now we're going to open to the floor. Any question?
So, thank you. I was wondering if it could be an interesting way to widen the scope of this type of research to include something about migration or the effect of migration on the real interest rate. Thinking about the latest, I don't know, 20 years, where it has become a much more important question than it was on the 20th century. So I don't know if this is an interesting question to ask when thinking about demography or the effects of demography on the real interest rate. So I was wondering how you would assess this kind of question.
No, for sure, I think it's very interesting. We've flirted with the idea of trying to do something on migration twice already, my co-authors and I. We did not. There's certainly a literature on this. I don't really know it, so for us it would be kind of trying to start a new agenda. It's certainly an important phenomenon, both economically, but then it has political repercussions, so we see that all the time. I encourage you, I don't know, maybe you add that to your agenda. We just haven't done it.
So first of all, I'm a big fan of this work. I think there's a huge literature on the natural rate. There's not so much about sort of the international convergence, if you like. Now, my question is on sort of, obviously there are other factors like productivity growth that also differ across countries, and where also increasing capital mobility would contribute. And so you focus only on demographics. And so I was wondering about the interpretation of the quantitative results, where you say demographics means 1/3, or can explain 1/3 of the fall in sort of, I guess, average real rates. And the combination of demographics and capital integration, financial integration, can explain half of the convergence. So you have basically 2/3 of factors that you're missing, but only in terms of the level, but only 1/2 in terms of the convergence. Whereas I would have thought whatever drives the real rate, it should also drive, if at least it should also drive the convergence. So I was just wondering, is that a fair?
Is a good point. I haven't thought of whether those things should be related or not, but let me just talk a little bit about what I think is behind the result. I completely agree, like, for example, convergence of growth, countries maturing and maybe their trend growth, becoming more similar. Let's say if we think of Japan growing way back and then, growing somewhat more. So I think here we just really singled out demographics because whatever is the agenda, but I think the whole thing of trying to understand this narrowing of rates, there's a lot more to be done, right? There's other factors that also, may have contributed, and I think have contributed to narrowing of range. We don't have a real exchange rate here in the model, and kind of, endogenous and fluctuating real exchange rate can be a factor that could explain, narrowing of real rates as well. So I think there's a lot. I'm on board. Regarding your specific question, so why, and it took us a little bit, it's kind of obvious, but it took us a little bit of time to figure this out, right? Why, for example, if I simulate perfect capital mobility in our model, real rates still don't, actually they converge eventually, right? Of course, the flows of capital become counterfactual. They become too big, and that's kind of what disciplines empirically the amount of capital mobility we have in the model. But one thing we have in the simulation I showed that matters is we have different discount rates across countries, right? So to be able to nail both the initial level of the real rates, the dispersion, we use these portfolio costs. We have two targets. We have the real rate targets, and we have these net, these assets and liabilities across countries as target. And we use discount factors and the cost parameters to try to match all these data points, okay? And it turns out the model sort of asks for different discount factors across countries. And that's sort of a factor that as long as capital mobility is not perfect, that sort of, keeps rates different because of the betas, okay? So this is all to say that actually maybe the model is explaining too much of the narrowing of the range. It just didn't do more because the betas are different, okay? With a common beta and the amount of financial integration that we fed through the model, rates would have converged even more. So we're certainly missing, many of the other drivers, and maybe I think here the model is in a sense too powerful to explain this. I don't know if I was clear. Maybe we can talk a bit more.
Okay, I have time just for one additional question. Maybe everybody is hungry. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, the presenters. So this is the end of our, not only the session, but the conference. So really, it was grateful to have this conference, and I hope you have enjoyed it. And I think next year we'll have another edition in May again, in Brazil again. I know that Carlos always tries to take it back to Rio, but I think that's not a good forecast, okay? So now we have the farewell lunch, and I wish you a nice trip back home for those that came from other cities, okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Switch the order.